Hey, welcome back to AP US History with Brandon Dell'Orto from Granite Bay High School. I was going to say Master Brandon Dell'Orto. Ooh, I think I'll call myself that. That sounds kind of like, like I'm really good at something. Anyways, this is our last lecture in preparation for the 2020 COVID document-based question that'll go up to World War II. They said they would go from Unit 3's 1754, the beginning of the French-Indian War, all the way up to possibly World War II. And it's ending in 1945 with the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs, Little Man and Fat Boy. Little Boy and Fat Man. Little Fat Man. Fat Man, Little Boys. We'll talk about that one later, how you can remember stuff. But this is World War II. But it's going to go back in time before we get to World War II. But before we get to that, just a little explanation of this feeble attempt of mine at facial hair, which is a feeble attempt. This is one of my really good friends over at Granite Bay High School. We've been teaching together for a very long time, going back to the Oakmont days. And this is Scott Brawley. Scott Brawley is an incredible biology teacher, and he also is the founder of the Granite Bay High School beard growing contest, of which I always join and always lose, because Scott Brawley, among a handful of other people, we've had some like Jim Cunningham from Ireland, who was an incredible beard grower. He could literally sneeze and an entire beard would come out. Scott Brawley's got the ability to basically do kind of a Duck Dynasty kind of a thing, like actually just grow a beard without really even trying. Like you wake up in the morning, you go, I think and the next thing you know, it just becomes a beard. It's just there. Now, I can't pull that off. This is me after 16, 17 years of trying to grow a beard. So this is all I got. But it's okay. I joined the party so that I can try. Of course, then this year, the whole beard growing contest has been kind of thrown off a little bit by the entire same thing that everybody's been thrown off. Although these guys probably don't really want to wear one. But this is why I do what I do. And I'm hoping to be able to get one like this, like a ZZ Top beard, but I don't think it's going to happen. This is me actually before I put my makeup on in the morning, because this is what COVID has done to me. This is what I look like before COVID, and then this is what the whole COVID quarantine has done. So it takes its toll on everybody. But just for emphasis of World War II and what World War II has done to the way we look at not just wars and international relations and whether or not the United States should play an active role in things, or should we just stay back, America first. 1 year at the end of a beard growing contest, I decided to shave everything off, but I basically wanted to leave something to just take a quick picture. And I only did this for anybody who wants to kind of try to slam me on this. I only did it to emphasize a point. So I took a picture and then quickly shaved that off, because that was just gross. Even looking at myself in the mirror with this little Hitler mustache threw me off. But here's the point I was trying to make. There are not a whole lot of options for the hair on the upper lip of a man in terms of what kind of things you can do for a mustache. This was one of them that was fairly popular at various times in American history and in world history, because again, men's lips have had hair on them for a long time, at least some people have had, and it has now been removed. Charlie Chaplin used to kind of have a fake one, but he had it. Laurel and Hardy, two of the big comedians of the time period, used to have it. But it's now been associated with evil. So this mustache style, of the only handful of styles a man could actually have in their upper lip, I'm pretty sure is gone for the rest of humanity. As long as we have pictures of Hitler and what he did, what he started, what he was responsible for, this mustache style is gone. So World War II, like all other things we've been studying, has a consistent system of time. Starts in 1939 with the invasion of Poland on September 1st by Adolf Hitler. Well, not Adolf Hitler himself. It's not like he just kicked the door down and said "Was ist das?" and started shooting away at the Polish people. But his armies, the Wehrmacht, that was almost perfect German, they'll invade on September 1st, 1939. And again, as I said, it'll be done on August 15th when Japan surrenders in 1945. Officially done on September 2nd, 1945, when they signed the actual surrender agreements. But like all other things in history, it is really the result of things that came before it, and will have echo effects on the things that will come after it. For us, the test this year, we're not going to worry about that, because they decided that just because of the coronavirus, we can't ensure that everyone's been tested on the stuff since it. So we're going to end it in 1945. But we are going to look back to the things that kind of caused it in the beginning. We're going to go a little bit back into World War I, how that played out, how we felt about it. That was one of the reasons why we're going to stay out of World War II for 2 full years and a little before we even get involved after Pearl Harbor's bombing, that day which will live in infamy on that December 7th. But it's also connected to politics, and it's connected to the Great Depression. But just a little framework. There were so many deaths in World War II that historians have not ever been able to get an exact number count because they're based on reports coming out of countries. The Soviet Union, we're pretty certain, has kind of doctored their numbers. They're no longer along. Now we just call them Russia. Vladimir Putin's Russia. And then China, for the most part, had millions of deaths. They also had the numbers all over the place. I've seen the numbers as low as 45 million. I've seen them as high as 100 million based on different historians and different criteria they're using. So let's just say 70 million deaths. It's a pretty round number. It's a very big number. To get a feel for how big this number is, let's just do a quick little bit of math. Let's say that you were hired for the simple sole job to shake the hand of a representative descendant of a person who died in this war. Your job was to just simply say, I'm so sorry. Shake their hands, look them in the eye, and then move them along. And every 5 seconds, from start to finish, I'm so sorry. From the moment you grab their hand till the moment you grab the next person's hand, you just do that. And you do that basically 5 times 70 million. That'd be 350 million seconds. And then we'll just divide them by seconds into minutes kind of a thing, just to get you a feel for how many minutes. And then we'll divide it again and divide it again. And if you worked a 40-hour week, with Saturday and Sundays off, 2 weeks off out of the year for your little summer vacation, it would take you around 48 years to simply say, I'm so sorry, to one person representing one person who died in this war. This is a big war. Biggest war the world's ever fought. And we get dragged into it like everybody else. Thank you, Hitler. But what caused Hitler to be able to come to power is the same thing that caused Franklin Delano Roosevelt to win in 1932 and be able to start a brand new progressive movement called the New Deal. As we looked at, unemployment was at its highest point in this time period. When he took over after Hoover left on that March 4th, 1933, our unemployment in the non-farm worker area was sitting around 30, 35, 40%. And again, those numbers are estimates. How can you actually say whether or not someone was working or not? And through his entire presidency, he never was able to get it really back down to normal, which is around 5% unemployment. Remember, this is unemployment. So that was unemployment at the beginning of the crash, right around there. And this is going to be unemployment all the way down. Now, his New Deal will only get us to about here. Now, one of the things we talked about the other day is that it's important to remember, regardless of how you feel about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, if you're a liberal, you tend to like him. The Democrats love him. The Republicans tend to vilify him. He is the pinnacle, the essence of big government, along with Lyndon Baines Johnson and his Great Society. But you cannot argue that for one little bump there called the Roosevelt recession, it was always getting better. Under Hoover, it was never getting better, it was less bad. So one of the things, except for that Roosevelt recession, is what was going on. And he is using Keynesian economics. He is spending money to jumpstart the economy, and that's the exact same thing that Hitler's doing in Germany. Except Hitler and Germany is getting themselves ready for a war that we aren't getting ready for until 1941. Or so. Well, we get a little bit prepared in this stuff. So federal spending, in terms of how it actually plays out in the United States, unemployment rate, and on down. So it's really the war that is going to fix the economy, not the New Deal. The war is really going to do it. And when you look at how expensive World War II was in comparison to other things, it's really expensive. All right, so let's dial it back just a little bit to make sure we got this. In 1928, Herbert Hoover beat the first Catholic candidate for president of the United States ever had, Al Smith of New York, former governor of New York. New York was the big guy at the time period. Now it's California. We've got 55 delegates to the Electoral College based on the population and your 2 senators. New York was the big boy back then, followed by Pennsylvania, Ohio. So those were usually the big states you wanted to win, and they were also conveniently swing states. They tended to vote Republican, but they could sometimes go back and forth. So if a Democrat could find a way to get a favorite son like Al Smith in there, there's a good chance you might win your home state. That didn't turn out for the Democrats nor Al Smith in 1928. The KKK came out from the hinterland and kind of campaigned against him. But Hoover will go down to crushing defeat, having crushed Al Smith in 1928. In 1932 himself, he will lose everything except for Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania and Delaware. Teeny little Delaware. Don't forget Delaware. Now, the actual popular vote was a lot closer, 40% to 57%, but the Electoral College was a big one. Well, in this exact same time, that Hitler in 1932 was running against the German president who was running for re-election, Paul von Hindenburg. Paul von Hindenburg, that was as big as a Hindenburg. Actually, the Hindenburg was him, sucking up a lot of helium, like, and then floating across Germany, giving speeches until he came down. Paul von Hindenburg. He came in second, but he spoke. He did all kinds of speeches. He's a really good speech maker. If you like your speeches angry and full of racism and all kinds of blames and oversimplifications with no facts and no figures and no dates and no details, no actual science behind it, but a lot of good old-fashioned propaganda that make you feel good to be a German, the actual German, over alles, over everybody. He did his thing. He campaigned, took his photo ops, did what he was supposed to do, but he still came in second. But his Nazi party was able to kind of stop the entire Reichstag, their version of Congress, and kind of grind it to a halt. And so ultimately Hindenburg, in essence, made him the prime minister, the chancellor. That'll be 1933. So Hitler will actually take over the running of the government because Hindenburg is the president, but he doesn't really run the government all the way until Hindenburg's death, when Hindenburg dies in 1934. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So Roosevelt is really going to try throughout his presidency and his New Deal to keep a balance between the extremes of communism and fascism, the extremes between socialism, where the government runs things that everyone needs, and capitalism, where you really don't have any rules on it, like the kind of 1890s and the 1920s. And he will try to walk that line. He will create, along with Congress in their 100 days, all kinds of different kind of agencies. The Brains Trust in those 100 days, those first 3 months, remember, the 100 days of the first 3 months of 1933, after he says his kind of like, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And that March 4th of 1933. And within the next 100 days, 3 months, Congress will be called in a special session, just like Hoover had done. And Congress will be told, you need to get things going. And they come up with all kinds of little alphabet agencies as that blocking. So don't in the test say alpha agent. Sorry, my head's in the way. Alphabet agencies. These alphabet agencies are all over the place. But one of the first things he does, again, is call a bank holiday, where all the banks are told to close down until we verify whether or not you're a good bank or a solid bank or a bad bank. Remember, if you want to point out some stuff for your 10th extra point, that was Hoover's idea, as are many of the different things. The FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, is going to be where banks kind of put money together to be a kind of like a little insurance corporation, a little insurance policy. And that's where if the bank goes just and fails, it doesn't drag down all your money with you. It used to be $5,000, went to about $100,000 when I was a kid. I think it's about $250,000 now. So this is an outgrowth. The Works Progress Administration, they're going to be building stuff, paying painters, and the Public Works Administration are going to be building big things. You're going to have things like the Tennessee Valley Authority. You're going to also have the Civilian Conservation Corps. We talked about this in the last lesson. NRA, the National Rifle Association, so you can shoot all these alphabeti. Not really, but the National Recovery Administration, the NRA. Going to try to work labor and business together, setting things like minimum wage, overtime pay, things like 40-hour work week, 8 hours a day. The AAA is going to be the Agricultural Adjustment Act. That's going to help farmers to get their prices to go up by paying them to not farm. Some people call it farm welfare. Ironically, subsidies for farms are no longer really something so much that the Democrats do. The Republicans have picked it up because they actually tend to represent those states. So it's a little bit of the game of hypocrisy that we've seen happen throughout all of history. And then Glass-Steagall that basically says banks can't be investment banks and regular old savings banks. They got to pick one of the two. That was then destroyed by Clinton and George Bush in those two presidencies that led to the 2008 crash, when a bunch of banks that were supposed to be actually protecting your savings started making bets on other things like hedge funds, and the thing came collapsing down. All right. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt is very Hitler-esque in some ways, and not to say that Hitler and FDR are both evil, but they were both masters of the new medium of radio and actual kind of microphoned speeches, and they were very good at it. Hitler is also very good at doing some other things. For example, in 1933, when their capital, that would be like the United States Washington capital, their capital burned to the ground, or at least was gutted, they caught a guy on the inside who had been in charge of this, they thought. At least they put him on trial. His name was Marius Vanderloo, and he was not from Germany. He was a mentally retarded man who had enough of a social retardation that he would basically kind of parrot whatever you told him to say. And as the story goes, he was sitting in the middle of the Reichstag, kind of in the big forum rotunda in the middle of it, with his shirt that had been charged, kind of rocking back and forth. And as the story goes, he had been claiming, I am a communist, I am a communist, I am a communist. Well, as the story goes, also, the actual Reichstag had an underground tunnel, like a lot of capitals do, ours does, that allowed the actual chairman, kind of the Speaker of the House, Hermann Göring, to be able to go back and forth. And it appears that the Nazis burned down their own capital, and they had stumbled across a guy that basically could be told to say whatever people tell him to say. And so he was put on trial, and Marius Vanderloo was found guilty of trying to overthrow the government as a communist of Germany. Notice the Hitler mustache back here. That's not Hitler, but that's one of those popular things, again, until you can't do it anymore. And Marius Vanderloo, in essence, will be executed. They will basically chop his head off. Not basically, that's exactly what they do. They chop his head off as an enemy of the state. And Germany will then pass a series of acts, including an enabling act that gives Adolf Hitler dictatorial power during this military emergency. And they really never take that off until Hitler dies and World War II is over in May of 1945. Well, he dies in April, but back to this time period. In August 1934, Paul von Hindenburg dies, and they decide they're not going to have elections for president. Hitler makes this big speech about how Hindenburg was the president. He's always been the president. He's been leading, Germany since World War I, the Franco-Prussian War, going all back to the Roman Republic. So no, I will just now be the Führer. I'll be the leader of the state and the leader of the government all together. And as of August 2nd, 1934, Hitler now is the guy. And man, do the people love him, because guess what happens if you speak out against him? Guess what happens if you're a newspaper that doesn't say glowing, wonderful things about the leader? You find that your newspaper doesn't operate very long. So when all you ever hear is that you are doing great and that he is wonderful and everyone's amazed, that's the kind of reception you get. And he will very quickly now remotivate and build up the German economy by going incredibly, horribly, deeply into debt to get ready for a war that the other countries of Europe and the United States at the time period weren't really ready to go into that much debt yet. Believe me, we've seen this happen before. It's a pattern in American history and world history. Politicians are expected to be cautious with the people's taxes. But when you have an emergency like a war, the people expect you to pull the credit cards out and do what you need to do to win the war. And that's exactly what Hitler started doing in 1935. So by 1935, going into 36, Germany had the envy of all envies, the country that had been kind of fixing itself. And Hitler was the guy that seemed to look like he could take charge. Remember, this is 1936 going to 1937, and he's not done anything bad yet, at least nothing overtly bad. He has not become the dictator we all know he will. We know the end of the story. The German people at the time period, some of his strongest support came from the upper middle class that said, yeah, he's cutting through the crap of politics. He's finally getting things done. He's breaking the kind of logjam of the actual politicians of the Weimar government is now gone. He is becoming much more efficient. That's what we need. A can-do kind of guy. So by 1933, when he's out there doing his work stuff and taking the picture, and there's this propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, there in the back, and they're doing all their different things to kind of like show that Germany's moving again, all these photo ops. He's the master of the photo ops, as many of our politicians will have to be over time. Boom, the marketing of this thing. He is a great marketer of the German people. They rebuild their entire Nuremberg area. They have these huge, big rallies with hundreds of thousands of people present. The Nazi swastikas all over the place, the Über alles, and the place will be close to silent as all of a sudden here comes Hitler walking down from the hill into the speaking area. Well, World War II had already been kind of started years before this. In 1931, Japan, that's that country there. It's an island if you're geographically challenged. Tokyo is their capital. Japan invaded Manchuria, which was like the equivalent of Maine for China. And it was very sparsely populated. It's incredibly cold, but it's natural resource rich. And it had a lot of different European investments, including Japan. Japan had a railroad, just like you would see like Germany having like a Volkswagen plant here in the United States. And Japan decided they needed an excuse to invade and take that territory from China. So in 1931, their Japanese railroad blew up. They had the documentable proof to prove that it was the Chinese. We now know, and they kind of knew then, that the actual documentable proof wasn't Chinese soldiers blowing up a Japanese railroad in China, Manchuria. It was Japanese soldiers wearing Chinese facsimile uniforms, which are not hard to fake. Just make a uniform, and had the pictures there to prove, well, the League of Nations has meetings, they talk, the Chinese say this is an invasion, Japan says we're only protecting what is rightfully ours because we have to be able to protect it, which ironically the United States have been doing all over Latin America, different time periods, sending in the Marines for national interest to support whatever kind of economic investment we have in different areas. Well, Japan basically says that. The League of Nations looks into it and they say, we don't believe you, this is an act of aggression, and so you are going to have to back out. And Japan basically does back out of the League of Nations, but stays in Manchuria. The League of Nations then responds by writing a very strongly worded and like nice parchment with like calligraphy and like gold embossed edges. Naughty, naughty Japan, you should not have done this. Signed us. But never does what the League of Nations is supposed to do, which is basically unite as one and basically collective security, they called it, jump the aggressor and kick him out. That doesn't happen. Ooh, what does happen is trade between Britain and France goes up with a Japan that now, with a military kind of invasion of a very large chunk of territory, needs more stuff. Oh, trade goes up with American businesses too, and we sell to Japan so they can do that even better. Hey, it's a Great Depression. Got to get your job someplace. What do you expect? Jeez. We will pass something called the Stimson Doctrine. This is from Secretary of State Stimson. Sorry, it's not doctrine. The Stimson Doctrine basically says the United States refuses to actually recognize this. So for all intents and purposes, we'll act like it never happened. We're going to continue to call it Manchuria, not the Manchukuo that you actually Japanese want to call it. Take that, Japan. We're not changing our maps. All right, so this then becomes our stuff. 1935, having seen how easy it is to take over a country and then just tell the League of Nations, we were just protecting ourselves. Benito Mussolini, the Il Duce, is going to invade Ethiopia. And the League of Nations, again, in October 1935, will hear from Haile Selassie, that's Haile Selassie, he's the king, in essence, the emperor, that this is an invasion, pure and simple. And Benito Mussolini basically says, we're just there to protect ourselves. Japan in 1936, going into 37, will then do a full-fledged invasion of China, and will begin to do what is known as the Rape of Nanking. 100,000 plus civilians will be killed, 9,000 plus women will be raped, male soldiers will be raped, people will be burned alive. This is stuff that the Japanese people never will hear until far later that their actual soldiers was doing in China. But pretty much the rest of the world did. Take a look at this. Where do you think this is? Ding, ding, ding. This is Chinatown. And they're protesting. The Boy Scouts of Chinatown, American Boy Scouts in Chinatown, are protesting that Japan is like a monster, a cold-blooded murderer. We know they're doing these things. Yet the United States, Britain and France, League of Nations, responds by basically signing a very parchment-like calligraphy thing. Naughty, naughty Japan, you shouldn't have done this. Italy, you shouldn't have done this. Oh, by the way, after the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 and after the invasion of Japan in 1937, business just booms with England and French and American companies selling even more stuff to Italy, more stuff to Japan. Hitler's watching all of this, and Hitler's basically sitting there going like, these democracies have no guts. But he does in German. It's like, oh, I mean, it's kind of like that. That actually wasn't what I just said. These democracies have no guts. Means I love you very much. I love the German language. I really do. But it always feels like you're being hit with syllables, consonants kind of a thing. Hitler can make anything sound like it is an angry rant. But for all intents and purposes, he's watching them do nothing. So by 1937, with all this stuff, including beheadings and all these things that are happening, doesn't seem to matter. Now, in defense of the democracies, because again, hindsight's very clear, 2020 vision, every one of the democracies, Britain, France, United States, almost most of Europe, Russia's not because Stalin's doing his thing, they're all going through the Great Depression too. It's a global depression. And exactly like if you want to do your parallel in the 1873 economic crash, where northern are going to start to wonder whether or not their tax dollars have to consistently be sent down to protect the blacks of the South that have been freed since 1865. I mean, what more can they expect out of us? When countries go through economic collapse, they become very nationalistic and they become very self-centered. And so, to a certain extent, I'm sure the conversations were going on in Britain, to what degree do we need to do anything to help out the people of China or to the people of Ethiopia? Who really could even find Manchuria on a map? It's not our job to protect everybody, but that's kind of what the League of Nations was supposed to do. And it wasn't. It was failing badly. So again, here we in essence have where World War II is going to jumpstart the economy, but it is also the cause of people like Hitler being able to take power, because people want an answer to this stuff. Well, while all this kind of stuff was happening in Manchuria in 1931, in Ethiopia in 1935, in China in 1937, the United States Senate, led by Senator Nye, start having all kinds of different investigations, because you can feel the war clouds on the horizon, and they start doing different subcommittee hearings, and they begin to, it's called the Nye Committee, so it's the Nye Committee is over here. The Nye Committee starts to investigate, Senator Nye, into how was it exactly that we got involved in World War I. When you think about it, Germany only sent a really kind of sneaky little telegram called the Zimmermann telegram. Should we really have gotten into that war? Or was there more behind it? Like bankers trying to make incredible profits, like big companies trying to make more money by selling weapons. And if we get in the war and then we go as a nation billions of dollars of debt, it's not like that billions of dollars of debt just gets flushed down a toilet. It goes somewhere into the pockets of somebody. And the Nye Committee basically found what they called at the time period merchants of death. Well, right there it says merchants of DE, merchants of death, merchant of. So the merchants of death is going to be a phrase you can use in this time period when you're writing about it. The merchants of death is a phrase that's going to come out of this Nye Committee. In essence, people were making money off of getting the United States involved in war that really we had no business getting involved in. So by the 1930s, as the country starts to see war clouds start to brew, what begins to form in many Americans' minds, remember this is the lost generation, the teens and the 20-year-olds that fought in World War I are now the 20 and 30 going into their 40-year-olds who are sometimes the leaders, and they're saying, you know what, no, we've been down this before. We should have listened to Washington's farewell address. Stay out of European wars. Stay out of entangling alliances. Have no political party. Okay, he was overshooting on that one. We like our political parties. But other than that, the man was brilliant, and we should do it. Here we have, cutely acronymed, SOS. Save our souls, save our sons. No convoys, no wars, no nothing. So another thing you need to know is the America First Committee. It's right there. We're going to talk about it a little bit more later. But beginning in the 1930s, the United States starts to go into its turtle isolationist shell. Isolationism is going to be a phrase you need to talk about if you're talking about foreign policy in the United States in the 1930s. We don't want another world war. If Europe is going to blow itself up, great. And a lot of people, more sarcastically, in essence, say not only should we have stayed out of World War I, but if you want to get the record straight, that's when we became the big powerhouse financially. We made money all over the place. So if Europe wants to kill itself, more money for us. So they pass a series of neutrality acts. There's neutrality acts in 35, 37, 39. Congress is going to continually pass laws that say we can't sell stuff to people who are fighting. It's against the law. If a war breaks out, you can't sell money, you can't sell stuff, we're going to stay out of it. We don't want to kind of get entangled in there like we did with Britain, loaning money out to them. So now we have to save Britain. So we decided not to do that. So here, let's again take a look at it because we're getting ready for a test. The 1928 election, this is the Catholic Al Smith. The KKK is going to rise, and they're going to kind of go, I don't know, we want to be a yellow dog Democrat and still vote for the Democrats because Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, or damn, he's a Catholic. So here is Herbert Hoover in 1928. He breaks the Solid South. That's one of the things you remember. And in 1932, he then was broken himself by another New York governor, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And as we go moving through this time period, you're now going to see Roosevelt in 1936 win really big. Only 2 states vote for. Look at poor Hoover. I mean, Al Flanagan. You know, Hoover at least can sit there going like, hey, at least I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 states. And Al Flanagan's like, yeah, but I like Kansas, even if Kansas doesn't like me. So the governor of Kansas doesn't. Wow. 8%. Oh, there's only going to be really one more election that's even worse than this. in terms of only one state voting for. But that's okay. But what happens in 1936, you've got to have this, we talked about the other day, so you got to have it in your head, is that this huge win, this massive win, is not just his, it goes all the way over into the government stuff in terms of Congress. And now Franklin Delano Roosevelt's going to be like, yeah. And he's going to try to reshape the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court has been knocking down his guys. So starting in 1935, right before the actual election of 1936, the Supreme Court, led by what Roosevelt called these 9 old men, and that was his phrase because he markets just like everybody else in the politics. He's really good at kind of marketing people like, Lion, Ted Cruz and Crooked Hillary and lock her up, that kind of marketing stuff. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was already really good at it, so he's like, these 9 old men. In essence, he's saying they're shutting down the New Deal. They've stopped the NRA. They find the AAA. Basically, the Supreme Court was more or less saying that the Congress overreached. Constitutionally, Congress can only coordinate any kind of commerce that goes across state lines, interstate. But any kind of business that only sits inside of a state, you can't. So these are predominantly Republican-nominated Supreme Court justices, and they continue to find these New Deal things broken, and they just say nope, and they cut them out. So by 1936, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, with his big win, starts going like, I got an idea. This is going to be great. And he introduces to Congress, he has a congressman introduce it actually, but he basically doesn't even talk to them. He says, I want a new court packing plan. It's called the court packing plan. And I want to put 6 new Supreme Court justices on the Supreme Court for everybody over the age of, I think it was 70, who refuses to retire. Meaning I could put up to 15. And here's where it backfires. And this is really important to understand why America stays out of the war for 2 years. One of the reasons is the Neutrality Act and the kind of lesson we learned of World War I, that isolationism, that we don't want to be brought into this thing again. Oh my God, it was so bad the first time. Why do we want to do it again? And here's the second reason. Roosevelt, having had such a massive win in 1936, by 1937, when he introduces his court packing plan, starts looking like a homegrown dictator. It wasn't like Americans weren't understanding Il Duce's kind of control. It wasn't like the United States didn't understand what Hitler was doing. Maybe the people of Germany didn't see it because they were only hearing on their almost free radios that it could only tune into local stations what was happening in Germany. But we were clear of it. This is the age of dictators. Stalin, Mussolini, Tojo, for Emperor Hirohito in Japan, and Hitler. And there's more. Franco of Spain. There's all kinds of dictators all over the place. It's kind of like the time period that we're living in here. It's like, who doesn't want a dictator? It just makes life so much simpler. So here then is obviously these bias statements. If you were to have these cartoons, here's Franklin Delano Roosevelt going like, more please, to Congress, and he wants more power. And the executive branch of the government, he's going to then do this stuff, Supreme Court revision. We're working our way towards dictatorship. That's FDR. So if you were doing bias recognition, obviously the artist of these 2 political cartoons is not a big fan of Franklin Delano Roosevelt nor his court packing plan. But that's okay because Roosevelt feels like, man, I got it. At 1936 was a huge win. But what he does when the House decides, his democratically controlled House, in 1937, rejects his court packing plan. So do a handful of senators. So what he decides to do in the 1938 midterm election is he goes out and actively campaigns to bump out about 21 different congressmen and a couple of senators who dared to defy him from his own party. So he's not running against Republicans. He's a Democrat, but he wants to primary them. In other words, I'm going to destroy you if you criticize me and try to stop me from doing what I'm doing. Sound familiar? I'm going to make it so you will never be able to be reelected. I'm going to go on my little fireside chats. I'm going to go out and do speeches. I'm going to do interviews with newspapers. You are dead to the Democratic Party if you challenge me. Well, in 1938, backfired. Only 2 of those guys actually got kind of primaried out. The rest of them got sent back by their constituencies, which was a very loud statement to Roosevelt. Holy crap. Look at that. From 331 to 261. From 76 to 69. The Republicans were making a comeback. And Roosevelt, who is probably our smartest political president we've ever had in terms of understanding the game as a whole game, finally learned his lesson. This was his big mistake. He should have known better. You don't tell Congress what to do. They're an equal branch to the government. You don't tell the Supreme Court, you work with them. And he decided, screw it. The power of the 1936 election, the landslide election, went to his head, and he, in essence, was hammered. So here then is the American people kind of looking at, these cartoons, you very rarely find many cartoons that are pro-FDR in this time period. We're going over the constitutional government into the pit of dictatorship. The chief executive is grabbing the legislative branch, and they're grabbing for the judicial branch. Americans were starting to see him as our own homegrown guy. So Roosevelt learns the lesson, and he goes into kind of hibernation mode in 38, in late 38, 39, and 39 is the year that Hitler, who has been screaming and yelling and saying Stalin is the evil guy of the world and communism is the thing that we all need to fight against, and here in essence is Mussolini, and there is Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of England, and I believe Daladier of France, and they're in essence talking about Czechoslovakia. And he goes, what? No chair for me? In 1938, Hitler screams and yells and puffs up his chest and basically says there's a little sliver of the Sudetenland that I need, and all I need is that Sudetenland sliver, and Britain and France more or less give it to him without even talking to President or Prime Minister Benes of Czechoslovakia. They just give him the Sudetenland. And in the spring of 1939, Hitler takes the good chunk of the rest of Czechoslovakia. Now, Poland did a little bit too, and Romania did a little bit too, and Hungary did a little bit too, but basically they took the rest of Czechoslovakia. And almost everybody kind of said, damn, Hitler can't be trusted. He says one thing, and then you get caught in a lie, and he just lies about it again. And he promises not to do something, then he turns around and does it. What the hell? How can we do this? So Britain and France finally kind of go, holy crap, I think he's going to keep going. And so they send ambassadors to go meet with Joseph Stalin, the dictator of Soviet Union, and they find that Hitler's already beat him to it. He has sent his foreign minister, von Ribbentrop, to go meet with Molotov, which is the prime minister, the foreign minister of Soviet Union, and they've come up with something called the Non-Aggression Pact. By the time Britain and France finally go, oh, damn, Germany's already got a Non-Aggression Pact signed. And they promise to never fight each other till death do they part, with an asterisk, I'm sure that was in German, so Hitler's going to now invade later on. But they also agreed that they were going to do something else in this process. So in 1939, on September 1st, the German forces roll over into Poland, and World War I technically now is begun. It is going. Now, what we know later is that that Non-Aggression Pact not only said that we're not going to fight each other, but it also agreed that the Russians over here and the Germans over here were going to split Poland up amongst themselves. That they were in essence going to share it, as this political cartoon shows you. These guys who hate each other, the fascism versus the communism, they're polar opposites, but they're both authoritarian dictators. The scum of earth, I believe. The bloody assassin of the workers, I presume. So here they are basically standing over the dead body of Poland. And any political cartoons of the time period are usually pretty easy to understand if you just give them the time to kind of understand it. So here then is this kind of disturbing, man, talk about hair. Anyway, so this is the game. Poland is split in half. Chum, chum, chum. And ironically, that's kind of what had been in 1918. There was no Poland in 1918. In 1918, in World War I's beginning all the way, there was the Russian Empire, and then there was Germany. Poland is going to be created out of a series of understandings at the Paris Peace Conferences in 1919. Poland had ceased to exist back in 1789. Oh, by the way, Russia is also going to take over Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They're going to invade Finland. So Russia is going to try to get back what Russia used to have. Russia feels it's obliged to have that. Germany is going to try to take back. And as soon as Poland falls, within about a month, so by November of 1939, Germany basically, Hitler says, I'm done. That's all I wanted. That's all I wanted. Oh, everybody, there's my dog. My dog has come to say hi. Hello, dog. Hello, Chloe. Hello, Chloe. She gets very lonely. She just likes to come and hang out. Hi! And when we talk about World War II, she gets very disturbed. It saddens her to think about all the death and destruction that happened in this war. So in 1939, going into 1940 January, in essence, nothing stopped. Nothing happens. It's called the Sitzkrieg War. They jokingly talk about the war being over. There's nothing to fight. It's over. No, wait about. So between the two of them, then, They're done. Oh, the Finns kind of do some interesting things. They start fighting against the Russians on skis. Oh, by the way, later when Germany attacks Russia, Finland will partner with Germany because, the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of a thing, and it won't go well for them by the time we're all said and done. So 1940 then starts with the phony war. A war that started, Britain and France have declared war on Germany, but they haven't done anything. Everybody's kind of sitting around, and Hitler goes like, I'm done. But he says like, kind of a thing, which means, again, I love you. Will you be nice to me? In 1940, Franklin Delano Roosevelt says publicly, coyishly, I'm not going to run for a third term unless drafted, in essence, unless the people want me to. So if you can tell this over here, this is a poster that tells you something. Uncle Sam gave the thumbs down, no third term, no president's ever had a third term before. And look at the title of it over here, the little kind of citation. These are Democrats for Wilkie. Wendell Wilkie be the Republican candidate. And so in 1940, the Republicans will pick a guy who ironically used to be a Democrat, sound familiar? Trump used to be a Democrat and then a Republican, to in essence run against Franklin Delano Roosevelt as a businessman, and he was a very successful businessman / lawyer kind of guy. And so what you have then is this kind of move where we don't want a president to be a president for a third term. And as these political cartoons over here, obviously, once World War II is up and running, and it's 1940, Hitler says, don't vote for Roosevelt. Japan's Tojo, Hirohito, sometimes they mix them up, don't vote for Roosevelt, meaning, they don't want you to vote for Roosevelt. So that's a pro-Roosevelt thing. The America First Committee, again, gets going full-blown. You've heard this phrase. It's one of President Trump's favorite phrases out there, America First. We got to look out for our own before we look out for anybody else. It's like nationalism wrapped around patriotism with a little shot of like testosterone kind of injection. Charles Lindbergh, Lucky Lindy, the guy who'd flown across the Atlantic solo, the first man to do it in 1927, the hero of the 20s, the can-do kind of guy, who also was a little bit anti-Semitic and kind of loved Germany. He's out there saying the same thing, going like, hey, America can't get involved in this war. We should learn from World War I. Let's just kind of batten down the hatches. We'll build up our Navy a little bit, and we'll let happen what happened. So by 1940, the problem was Germany had taken over almost everything. The war had started up again. So we have the American Liberty League and a bunch of people out there saying, we need to not do anything. Well, the 1940 election, finally, the Democratic Party kind of like begs, so it makes it look like Roosevelt didn't really want the job, so he can actually say, well, I would rather not have run, but since you need me so badly, I mean, who am I to turn down my country calling and asking? So the Roosevelt coalition will jive up again. This time we're going to put Henry Wallace on the ticket, the old agricultural secretary, who's super liberal, and you'll see why this is important later on. And Roosevelt smartly, in 1940, as the war now has picked up speed, the Sitzkrieg War is gone April 10th. Germany invaded Denmark. They invaded Norway. May 10th, they invade France and Belgium, the Netherlands. Next thing you know, it's like Central Europe. By the time we're getting ready to have an actual election in 1940, Europe is pretty much done. And America's like, no, look how powerful the Germans are. Let's just kind of back off. Don't do anything. Well, Roosevelt smartly puts two high-ranking Republicans on his cabinet right before the election of 1940. He puts Frank Knox, the Secretary of the Navy, and Henry Stimson, who used to be the old Secretary of State for Hoover, as the Secretary of War on this thing. And he's going to be basically in there. So that's behind my head here. But basically, he is super smart. In the 1928 election, 1932 election, here you go, 36 election. Here's his 1940. The trifecta, the third time's a charm. Wow, a lot of states don't go for Roosevelt in this election. More so than in this one. But electorally, that's still a big win. That's still a big win. Popular vote, still a big win. So Roosevelt is popular enough in 1940 that he has been able to kind of pull off the game. So here's the connection point you got to do. In 1937, because of the 1936 win that went to his head, he decided to screw with the Supreme Court, to stack it with a bunch of his own guys. That caused America to kind of go like, oh my. And so he went out and tried to destroy a handful of Democrats, his own party, that dared to defy him in 1930 midterm election. That backfired. So by 38 going into 39, the year the war starts, we've already passed a series of neutrality acts. America obviously doesn't want to get involved in another World War I. Roosevelt finally regains his political senses, which were some of the heightened senses of a master, like me at the beginning of the tape. And he is going to say, don't want in. If the people don't want it, they don't want it. So in the 1940 election, literally in October, I think it was Madison Square Garden, he makes a promise live on radio to the American public 2.5 weeks before the election. Your boys won't be sent to any foreign wars. I can promise you that. If elected. We don't want in the war, we won't get in the war. As he's walking off stage, as the story goes, and he wasn't really walking because he had those polio braces that he needed, but he could make it look like he's walking. So and he always had his son's arm or another politician's arm. One of his advisors said, Mr. President, how could you make that promise? It wasn't even in our speech. I mean, how can you make a promise that we won't get involved in this war? What if we're attacked? And then Roosevelt supposedly turns and kind of smiles and says, well, then it's not a foreign war, is it? So Roosevelt will win in 1940. He will keep both houses of Congress. This is going to be the secret to Roosevelt's success as a very successful, gets lots of stuff passed president, except for the court packing plan, his one big Achilles heel, and that's because he's got nothing but a friendly Congress. And as you'll see, the Supreme Court issue begins to go away also in this time period because he will slowly get retirements and he'll be able to then appoint Republican replacements in the form of Democrats. And so we end up having an almost entirely Democratic-leaning Supreme Court. For those of you who are Ruth Bader Ginsburg fans and you're afraid that Trump is going to appoint a bunch of Republicans, it's been done before. We had a bunch of Republicans, then we had a bunch of Democrats. It's not new. It happens out of American history all over the place. All right, so here then in 1941, in March, he decides he's going to do something. He gets Congress to pass the Lend-Lease Act. That's going to keep us out of the war, but we're going to be able to help the good guys. It's a kind of end run around the Neutrality Acts because we're not really selling stuff. That would be a violation of the Neutrality Acts. We're lending stuff to the troops. And they're not really paying us, they're leasing us things. This was kind of like a sneaky way around this, called Lend-Lease. The United States is going to start to give billions, in today's money, probably about just shy of $1 trillion, to our friends and allies, mostly Britain. It's going to go all over the place. It's going to go to China. It's going to go to Russia. It's going to go here. Most of it, again, is going to go to Great Britain. They're going to get the massive, biggest amount of this thing by the time everything's said and done. And we then become what Roosevelt calls the arsenal of democracy. Before we get involved in the war, we are going to be the guys that are going to protect the world. We're not in the war yet. Hitler then invades Russia, Operation Barbarossa, on June 22nd, 1941, and it is the biggest land invasion in the history of the world. And when he does that, he breaks his neutrality pact with the non-aggression pact with Russia. So Hitler lied. Who can blame him? And here's an interesting thing. Now, the bad, horrible, totalitarian dictator, Hitler, is fighting the bad, horrible, totalitarian dictator, Stalin. And so you get this quote. We see that Germany is winning. We ought to help Russia. And if Russia's winning, we ought to help Germany. And that way, let them kill as many possible. Although I don't want to see Hitler victorious under any circumstances. Neither of them thinks anything of their pledged word. Well, that seems pretty Machiavellian. Let's let them cannibalize each other. That was Senator from Missouri, Harry Truman, at the time period. He's not a fan of Russia. You'll see how this plays out later on. So now the war is up and going. We got all the good guys. We got the people going on. Manchuria has been invaded. Ethiopia has been invaded. Later on, Haile Selassie says, hey, they're not doing something. Then Germany, then bam, wham. So here then, we have what are known as our European theater war and our Pacific theater war, but we're still not in it. We're just the arsenal of democracy. Until December 7th, 1941. A day which will live in infamy. For those of you who know, this is the Pearl Harbor Memorial, sitting on top of the USS Arizona that went down on that day. December 7th, 1941, the Japanese may strike. They actually did strike, and we got hit and caught totally off guard. They hit our fighter pilots, planes on the ground. They hit our ships, and next thing you know, we are now involved in the war. Now, there's all kinds of different kind of suggestions. There's conspiracy theories of whether or not we knew it was happening. We had broken their code. We had broken their diplomatic code. Theoretically, the argument goes that we really didn't know what was going on with the diplomatic code. But we'd also been pushing to kind of get them involved in stuff. And it was called the Arthur McCollum 8 action item letter. Arthur McCollum was a kind of a specialist for the Navy Intelligence Office. And he had been asked by Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, what would we have to do, in essence, to get Japan to finally get so pissed off at us that they would attack us, and then we could basically go to war and save the world. And it was called the 8 action item memos. And the 8 action item memos basically are followed to a T. Every one of those 8 So there's all kinds of conspiracy theories out there as to whether or not FDR knew Pearl Harbor was going to be attacked, and furthermore, did he even prod Japan into attacking it? Because as we know, we were staying isolationist, but once we were in, now we're in. And once we get in the war, the whole war changes, and we basically save the world. Yay, us. Yay, USA, USA. Wait, I gotta go. USA, USA, USA. This is going to be the war that we basically really come to and save. So from 1939 to 1945, we got a European theater. It's going to be Hitler versus, and Mussolini, not versus. Those guys like best buddies. Mussolini was like Hitler's personal hero. He had all of that. It's like, I can't believe that we're actually working together. But again, in German, he's like, I like you very much, Benito. Germany is going to be facing off mostly against Great Britain with Winston Churchill, their bulldog prime minister, and Joseph Stalin. And then once Pearl Harbor happens and Germany and then Italy declare war on us, so those will be called the Big Three. Now, the Big Three are going to be then counterbalanced. In the Pacific theater, it's pretty much an all-American thing. Japan is led by Emperor Hirohito, who ironically was a big fan of democracy, so he wasn't really overruling their Japanese Diet, which looks like the word diet, but it's basically their Reichstag, which basically means Parliament, which basically means Congress. But the guy who was really behind the scenes was the military leader, Hideki Tojo. And Tojo, he's the guy kind of in charge of it, and he's fighting against not me, that's us. So in the Pacific theater, basically it is a United States almost all by ourselves thing against Japan. Now the rule of thumb was that everyone believed that Hitler and, well, not him, but Hitler was the bigger threat. And so the focus was going to be on ending the war over here, winning the war in the European theater, and then kind of holding at arm's length Japan so they don't take anything new and doing what is called island hopping and jumping closer so we could take a couple of different islands in order then to aero bombard, bring the war to Japan by the air, and that's kind of what we're going to do. So we got our Big Three. We got Stalin from the USSR. You got to be able to have the Big Three. We got, obviously, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and then Winston Churchill. These are the Big Three. The Big Three are now to be countered with, like, you know, Hitler's Germany. Germany have Hitler, Hirohito's Japan, and Mussolini's Italy. So, or Italy's Mussolini and Japan's Hirohito and Germany. But again, it's Tojo. But we'll basically call those the bad three because they're bad. The bad. So we got our good guys and our bad guys in this stuff. And again, our plan is going to be to let Russia basically take the brunt. And that's exactly what the United States does. Throughout most of the war, we are going to spend all kinds of money helping Russia fight Germany, and we will kind of slow walk it. We'll have Operation Torch in 1943. Remember, they don't ask many questions on the multiple choice about wars and battles. And since this year doesn't have a multiple choice, they're going to ask even fewer, which is like 0 multiple choice questions on battles. If anything, they're going to generally ask you questions about our stuff. So the United States is going to let Russia really pay what is known as the blood price in this thing. So the United States is going to have about 400,000 deaths in World War. I've seen the number around 350. Russia's going to have around 26 million. So as I was told in my math classes, if you're comparing numbers and they got a bunch of zeros in them, the easy way to do it is just isolate out the zeros and take them out. So in other words, for every 4 Americans that died in this war, Russia's going to lose 260. Or if you want to bring it down even more, for every 1 American dies, 65 Russians will die. So for every 1 American that dies in World War II, 2 full classes of Granite Bay High School are going to die for Russia. So it's a disproportionate number. However you need to say it, it doesn't mean Stalin's a good guy. It doesn't mean Franklin Delano Roosevelt is a manipulative guy. It basically means that this is smart politics. Because Franklin Delano Roosevelt's perspective, why would we ever not want this? If we're going to go give billions of dollars to Russia and it's going to be millions of their boys that die fighting Germany, who in America wouldn't want to rather have, sadly, but it has to happen, someone's going to have to die to fight Hitler, it be Russia's guys, the Soviet Union's guys, the USSR's guys, rather than ours. Winston Churchill will be a bit more clean. Winston Churchill will basically say, and I'm loosely paraphrasing it, I would walk through hell holding the hand of the devil himself to defeat Hitler. We're certainly going to work with the Soviets. Hitler's the bigger threat. So the enemy of my enemy, Sun Tzu says, in The Art of War, is my friend. So the United States becomes really good friends with a pretty bad dictator in World War II, but that is going to be part of the way we play the game. Now, we will then really ramp up, now that we're in the war, this arsenal of democracy. Henry Ford will make a Willow Run plant that's going to be pumping out B-24s basically every like 10 to 15, 20 minutes. These things are coming off the assembly line just like anything else. This is when we really get big in it. And not only do we actually start to produce all the weapons with which this war will be won, the United States will also start our own Office of War Information. And this is going to be our way of proving to the entire country that we have a consolidated fight, that this is us together. We're fighting together. In essence, it's our propaganda agency. Germany had a propaganda agency, and they just call it the propaganda office. We basically call it the Office of War Information. So we're not propagandizing, we're just giving you information about the war. But it's all coming through a central source. So the OWI is one of the alphabet agencies that is very rarely talked about. It's a parallel to the Committee of Public Information from World War I. So the OWI is going to have official stories about what's going on in the war. And it is going to hire a bunch of artists to do all kinds of posters. It's going to hire musicians to do songs. It's going to basically be like the WPA, just war style. And it is going to make America get connected to the idea that we're fighting for, and here's the phrase they use most often, unconditional surrender. Because you don't negotiate with the devil. You do not cut deals with Satan. And we'll start to really focus this war on being about the bad guys versus the good guys. And that's what this war is going to be about. So Rosie the Riveter comes out of this. This is going to be a war production. I don't know if you can see this down here. The War Production Coordinating Committee. So this is going to be an offshoot of the WPA. And it's going to come up with this idea of making women feel we can do it. They tell us we're not strong enough to work in men's work in the factories. We can do it, and we can still look really good. And so one of these Rosie the Riveters is going to be this lady, a lady by the name of Norma Jean, a redhead, that a Office of War Information photographer came by and saw it and said, wow, you look really pretty. Do you mind taking some pictures? And then later on, he took some more pictures of it. And you get to know her later on as Marilyn Monroe when she decides to platinum blonde her hair. But she was a Rosie the Riveter in this war. So Rosie the Riveter, you got to talk about. This parallel is going to be Republican motherhood. Just like the world saw in World War I, the women are going to come out and fight again. They're going to do their thing. Well, interesting element of Rosie the Riveter and women's fashion at the time period, bathing suits for women were supposed to be able to conceal everything. It's like an American burqa or something like that, where everything is supposed to be concealed except for her hand, and it would go all the way down. You can't see behind my head here. Down to her feet, and then by the 1900s you could see kind of her shins. You still couldn't see anything except an elbow and a little tiny, and then all of a sudden you can see kind of up a little bit, and then, oh my gosh, by 1925 those flapper looks, look, they can see their mid-thighs. By 1927, what the... All right, because we had something called the War Production Board also during this time period, we were rationing everything. Meaning there's not enough food to fight the war and feed our people. There's not enough sugar. There's not enough gas. There's not enough silk. There's not for our parachutes. So you had to buy everything with these little ration stamps in the war. Politicians were able to get by this. They didn't have to have the rations because, they had connections, stuff like that. But another thing in terms of cloth, because we had so many millions of men, 15 million men ultimately will end up serving in the military in some form or another, 12 million at any given one time. And they need uniforms, and they need a couple sets of uniforms. So what we're going to end up having are these production quotas. So we have to not have as much fabric being used. And so women's fashions, this will be when the kind of more modern one piece is going to come in, and eventually the bikini is going to come in 1946, because we have to save actual fabric. So now you can see not just their mid-thigh, but you can see their whole thigh. This is Betty Grable, one of the pinup girls of the time period. So this is going to have an element of, we all start to make movies with Hollywood. One of the series of movies, there are 6 of them called the Why We Fight series, is going to explain stuff in propaganda. Why are we doing what we're doing? Now, this is not new, and Hitler didn't create it, but he really mastered it. All propaganda has to be popular and has to accommodate itself to the least comprehension of the least intelligent, of those whom it seeks to reach. In other words, make it simple, lower it down, make it as easy can be. And he also felt this one was happy. How fortunate for leaders that men do not think. So that's what we're trying to not have happen in these classes. So we end up having then Rosie the Riveter. Women, you can do it. You can be our modern, actual Republican motherhood. You can do what we always know you can do. And this has become a kind of a meme/icon over the years. And eventually, it's going to start to change the way people look at themselves in this. All right, real quick, I'm going to just close this because it sounds like a bunch of things are going to start happening in the back. Hello. So what we have then is a vast movement, let me get myself back in here, of trying to give rise to the idea that women don't believe what we've been telling you for hundreds of years, believe what we're telling you now, which is you are as capable as men, you are as strong as men, you can do whatever men can do, and don't believe anything other than that. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is the birth or the rebirth of the feminist movement and the equality movement for women. In the idea that what's most important isn't necessarily convincing men that women can do anything that men can do, but women have to convince themselves that what men have been telling them, what society's been telling them, what religion's been telling them, what culture's been telling them for hundreds of years, it's not true. And what we end up finding is that most of the time, historically, when women are allowed the opportunity to do something, they not only do as well as men, they tend to do better. Sorry, my XY chromosome brothers, but it's kind of true. So this is the birth of the modern feminist movement, because these will be the mothers of the daughters of the 1960s, who in raising them will look back to the good old days when they worked 8, 9, 10 hours a day. They actually came home, took care of the kids. They were these superwomen who basically helped win the war. All right, we also have our racism issues start to kind of peel away a little bit during this time period. This is going to be the beginning of the modern civil rights movement. Just like the mothers of the daughters of the feminist movement, you will have fathers and mothers who will be black citizens who in World War II rose up to save the world from the bad guys, and then will tell their sons and daughters, who will then be going to college in the 1950s and the 1960s, and will become the foot soldier leaders, founding fathers of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. A handful of people in America, sadly, larger than a handful, felt black people were just not smart enough. They're just not. Remember, Hitler was raised in the age of the social Darwinism time period. He was born in the 1880s. And so many of our older leaders in America have been born in the same 1880s, 1890s, 1900s in this kind of racism, the xenophobic social Darwinism. I mean, everybody understands that God's a white person, don't we? And the black people just can't do it. And they certainly aren't smart enough to be able to operate these highly technical things called bombers and fighters. Handful of graduates, college kids from Tuskegee University are going to be called the Tuskegee Airmen in 2006. They finally got their Medal of Honor. Many of them weren't around anymore to receive it, but finally President Bush gave them their Medal of Honor in 2006. These were heroes who proved that they could do just as well as white men what everybody had been telling them they couldn't do, the Tuskegee Airmen. Eleanor Roosevelt, wife of the president, will also push with A. Philip Randolph, the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, a black union, to say, hey, you know what? The time has come to not only end lynching, where people will be killed without a trial, but also equality for pay. And they will push, and they will push, and they will finally get, in the midst of the war, Franklin Delano Roosevelt to pass Executive Order 8802 that basically says the federal government can't discriminate based on race when it's hiring. This will lead to Harry Truman's desegregating of the armed forces in 1948. But it starts here in 1941, and it also basically says that white people have got to be paid the same as black people, and black people got to be paid the same as white people. And if you are a military contractor making things for the United States, you got to follow by the same rules. So you're a private company, that's fine. Do what you want in your private company. But if you're working on an American contract for the war, you will follow those rules too. So this, again, is a baby step in the civil rights movement of the time period. Another baby step is you're going to have a bunch of people start to migrate to what was known as the Sundog Migration. The migration of World War I had been up here, but now because this war is so big, with our 12 going on 15 million people, many of the bases are going to be in warmer climate areas and along the coasts. So what's going to happen then is this is when all of a sudden a bunch of different states are going to find a bunch of federal money coming into them to build up Navy bases. That's when Oakland's going to explode in that time period. So people are going to begin to migrate away from, in the 1940s, and it's going to really pick up speed in the 1950s and 60s, into what are known as the Sun Belts. In other words, the southern United States looking for jobs and also being recruited in the Army. And a disproportionate number of the Army bases are going to be in places where it's not so expensive to heat them. You don't need as much thick insulation. You can just build some kind of like thrown up kind of stuff, and bam, pretty much the guys can start getting your boot camp. Well, this migration, both in and around, is going to cause a lot of race riots, just like in World War I. Detroit's going to see probably the worst. 34 will be dead after a couple days in June of 1943. Black people, 34 of them are going to be killed. The racism is they're just going to drag people off of trolley cars and beat them up. Hundreds are going to be wounded in this race riot just in Detroit. And it's going to happen in other cities. The police will often just sit by and watch these angry whites just get pissed because the blacks are taking their jobs or they're living in the same area as us. So the North is going to have its racism issues. This one says 23 dead, but ultimately it's going to end up being 34 by the time everything's said and done. So we have race riots in 19 43, 44. We had already had the Zoot Suit riots going on in 1941, going into 42. The Zoot Suit riots were when a bunch of Hispanics in LA and San Diego had decided, this was kind of like the style in the late mid-20s, and it was still for a lot of Hispanic Americans kind of the style. It was called the Zoot Suit. It was like overly baggy, long, and like each of your legs could fit like 3 man's legs in there. Well, this, to many of our newly boot camp trained GIs, 19, 20, maybe 18 years themselves, would see this as kind of an affront to the production quotas. You're not supposed to use that much material. And so on a particular night, they went down, got in a fight with a couple guys that were dating some girls. They all had the same height, and they beat up a couple people. Eventually, a handful of people died. But this was seen as like an anti-Latino riot in the Southern California states of San Diego and LA. But it's easy to have that anger kind of pop out when your propaganda is basically hyperventilating this kind of racism. And so comic books even will start getting in the game of understanding. So even Superman says you can slap a Jap, as his comics will say in this time period. And here's Captain America, the pinnacle of America, is kind of like, can-do, patriotic spirit, the essence of America. And even him sitting there saying, I'll get you for that, you yellow monkey. So he's calling this Japanese soldier, obviously a racist overtone. That's okay. He goes from the Pacific over the European area and beats up these other Nazi guys. You started a wolf finish it. So there's Captain America even giving a blow to Hitler. And Hitler able to take a punch like that. Maybe Hitler was tougher than I thought he was. So even comic books will get involved in this. Music will get involved in this. The entire time, we get into this war. This is known as the Good War. And one of the reasons it's called the Good War is it had so much intense propaganda that it kind of solidified our sense of who we are. But it came at the expense of somebody who wasn't us. And the biggest group that took this hit are going to be the Japanese Americans. And as you can tell, this bias is easy. The Japanese have like these monster fingers. They're overly sized teeth. They almost look like vampires of sorts. Then people started beating up on Chinese people. And so even Life magazine came out and tried to help people how to tell a Jap from a Chinese. And they gave you this simple, like, all Chinese people look like this and all Japanese people look like that. So next time when you're pissed off and patriotic and you want to beat the crap out of an Asian, make sure you're picking on a Japanese man. They never called them Japanese. They called them Japs. So this is going to be part of the game of this time period, and it is going to unleash latent racism against Japanese and Asian Americans in California, Oregon, and Washington that have been there since the Chinese Exclusion Acts of the 1880s and before that. And so many Japanese, many of these who were born here, they were citizens of the country just like anybody else. Some of them had been here for a couple of generations going back to the 1800s, found that they're not wanted. Don't you love it when little Billy takes an active role in civic politics? God, I'm so proud of him. He's a little chip off the old block. Down on the Japs, the rats. President Roosevelt, against his better judgment, was kind of compelled in 1942, which is a midterm election year, to sign Executive Order 9066. And Executive Order 9066 basically says that the Japanese need to go into internment camps, and they'll be given 48 hours notice to be able to get all their belongings into a couple of suitcases they can carry, and they're going to have to vacate their businesses, they're going to have to vacate their farms, they're going to have to vacate their homes, they're going to have to leave, and we're going to put them in these little internment camps. The guy who was pushing hard and heavy for it in California was our Attorney General, Earl Warren. And amazingly enough, he was running for governor in 1942. And I don't know how you might think that getting people really pissed off at the race of people that you happen to be fighting the country of could work in old bad, but this is war. We need a new governor to be able to kind of lead us against this race that is a bunch of rats. So Earl Warren will win in 1942 the California governorship. He'll become the Chief Justice, ironically, who's going to help make the Civil Rights Movement possible in 1954 with the Brown versus Board of Education decision. But as you hopefully remember from 8th grade, you don't have to run when you're a Supreme Court Justice. You can kind of just do things the way you want to do things once you're there. So this is going to be leading to Japanese internment. For those who need to see this to kind of know your stuff, Japanese internment is a massively important story in America's history of trying to live up to the ideals we have. And we will not have internment camps for German Americans nor Italian Americans, although some of them will be detained by the FBI as spies. And these will be sent 110,000 Nisi and 80,000 EC. Basically, people who were born in Japan and came over here, but the Nisi were American citizens. By the 14th Amendment of the Reconstruction era, they are citizens with all the same rights. You can't deny them, but we did. The Supreme Court in this time period will say, yeah, in time of war, you can kind of do that. So they will be hauled off with whatever they can carry. Everything else has got to be left behind to these various camps that are going to be sent across the United States. And these camps are going to be kind of these little ramshackle camps, but they actually still do well. They'll actually allow a number of volunteers to fight in Italy, the 442nd, but these War Relocation Agency, WRA relocation camps, will be sent across the United States. And then as the war goes on, this is something we don't really have time because we're pushing an hour and 10 minutes as it is now. But in essence, this is a series of letters of a white family talking to a Japanese family, and they're arguing over a refrigerator that had been the Japanese family, but the white family then kind of stole/used it for the duration. And this was really expensive. They were big, expensive ticket items back then in terms of refrigerators compared to now. And finally, this white family says, fine, we'll give you the damn refrigerator back, but at here's enclosed, you will see you find a letter. And I'm expecting you to be called to active duty. Please let us use the refrigerator. And the Japanese family kind of goes, it's our refrigerator. We want it to be able to be stored. I don't want people to keep using it. It's ours. And finally, the final letter is here. It's like, last night your refrigerator was delivered to Lewis, who came to take it out to the Perkins Ranch. Closed, you will find a personal check for $5. A little bit for using it. I'm greatly sorry that you've taken the action that you have, for I believe it will now be impossible for you or your family of Japanese people who we used to love, we all went to the same church, now ever to come back to Tulare or Cortez, since this is now known. Your attitude in favoring Japan will make it more than ever evident to the people of the community that in the emergency, you Japanese cannot and should not be trusted as good American citizens with rights thereof. Your whole attitude and correspondence is being turned over to the proper authorities, the FBI, and in due time you will doubtless hear more. However, as Christians, we do love you, but cannot let our sympathies for you to overlook the fact that you are enemy aliens in a time of war taking action favorable to the enemy. And you're an enemy alien because you're a Jap. Wow. So our internment camps are going to then cause a racism through the Office of War Information in order to solidify us working as one. The outcome of that is going to be this anger against the Japanese. And you'll see these things. Don't want any Japs back here ever. So when they are allowed to leave the camps, they are often not allowed to come back to the places that they used to live before. It is going to hyperventilate racism in terms of Japanese. Now, ironically, Japan will end up being one of our best friends from 1945 to this moment in time, just as Germany will be. We'll flip those around and turn them as against the Russians. And most Americans just can't do that mental gymnastics that quickly because they emotionally feel these things. It's the same thing we talked about with the Civil War. The war wasn't so much about ending slavery, but slavery was the emotional issue that would get people to vote and get people out to the polls. So we have a similar situation in this time period happening. And we just keep seeming to fall in these ideas. If you just tell a lie big enough, double down. And this is brilliant propaganda if you think about it, because most people, when caught in a lie, kind of like, sorry, I don't know what I was doing, and they tell you. But Hitler kind of mastered the art of, if you get caught in a lie, lie again. If you get caught in that lie, double down and lie again. Just keep lying. After a while, common sense people were like, oh my God, it must be true, because, I mean, if it was a lie, he would have copped to it by now. He would have admitted to it by now. So the lie for America is that Russia and the United States are great friends. That's the lie for America, that we are part of the big family. So Russia, worst dictator the world's probably ever seen in terms of sheer number of his own people dying. Joseph Stalin, the man of steel. Franklin Delano Roosevelt will not by accident call him Uncle Joe. He's part of the family. Don't you remember last Thanksgiving? You're sitting at the end eating all the yams. So we have then now in the big three is Stalin again and Russia. These are all our big friends. We're all going to work together. And as World War II is ending, fun things are already beginning to begin. As the Russians come massing through and rolling up with all this extra lend-lease money and industrial know-how that we've helped them with, we find that they are moving through, and Stalin's going like, hey, but right about that moment in time, right when they're about there is October 1944, Churchill makes an undisclosed visit to Moscow to meet with Stalin in 1944, October. Doesn't tell Roosevelt about it. The two of them meet, they have a great time, they laugh, they joke, and they in essence sign a thing saying, when the war is over, Romania will be 90% Russian, and we'll have about 10%. Greece will be like 90% Britain, and Russia will have like 10%. Yugoslavia will split 50-50%. Hungary will be about 50-50. Bulgaria will be Russian 75-25. And he shoves this piece of paper, Churchill does, over to Stalin, and Stalin in essence looks at it, taps it with a cigarette, and says, da. Churchill then responds, after a couple weird moments, Remember, he's a leader of a democracy. Having so casually decided the fate of hundreds of millions of people, maybe we should get rid of the evidence. And Stalin's translator then tells what he said, and Stalin then says back in Russian, of course, you keep it. I'm a dictator. I don't care what people think. You're the one that's got to run for re-election in the next thing. So at the Tehran conference, however, before that, we met with these guys, and on the way home, President Roosevelt made an unscheduled stop in Saudi Arabia to talk to King Saud. And in essence, what he said was, hey, currently, British companies are actually refining your oil found in your territory, and you guys are basically only being given like 30% of it, while the British keep 70%. What if I told you that after the war is over, American companies would split it 50-50? So in other words, in 1943, while the war was going on, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was already positioning himself and American oil companies to take over from Saudi Arabia, British oil companies. Remember, this is our favorite country in the world, and we're getting ready to screw them in the back, just as they get ready to screw us in the back. This is part of politics. It's so much fun. So by 1944, they're moving in. We're moving in after D-Day, the invasion on June 6, 1944, a great invasion, the biggest amphibian invasion of all time. We've been moving up, slowly up through Italy, fighting and deposing stuff. France has got their, free French government in England, being led by the great French leader of the time period. You'll know him later on. We'll talk about him in a while. So we have this movement, and they meet in 1945 to decide what's going on, and they meet in the Crimea. It's right over here at the Yalta Conference. And the Yalta Conference, the Big Three meet, and this is basically what they want. Roosevelt, Big Three Conference, the last move, how we're going to make sure this works. And what Roosevelt wants is that as soon as they can, Japan is the target. Russia, please help us. Stalin's like, dude, we've already lost 26 guys for every one of your guys, and you want us to lose even more? Because Russia and Japan had a non-aggression pact, just like Germany and Russia had a non-aggression pact, but that one hadn't been broken. They fought once in the beginning of the war. It was super bloody, so both Japan and Russia basically back off. And Russia says, okay, 3 months. 3 months after the war in Europe is over, we will join you in the battle against Japan. But we want chunks of Japan. We want some territory, just like we want here. So what you have then is, again, the same basic idea that we talked about. So this is what Franklin Delano Roosevelt wants. He wants to continue this policy of letting their guys die instead of our guys die, as this had happened in Russia versus Germany. And in Germany, it was really important because Germany, basically, for every one American that died, soldier that died, about 65 Russian soldiers died. We also want to kind of chop up Germany, split it up into parts. That won't be that super important until the next time period, but it won't be part of this story. And the United Nations is going to be set up. The United Nations is going to be kind of a new setting of this thing. We're going to kind of set it up. It'll be the League of Nations now with like a renewed purpose, the United Nations. Same basic thing Wilson wanted, but now he's going to get it. All right, and the war will end on August 6, 1945, with the dropping of the first atomic bomb to be used on people. It's Little Boy. And then Fat Man is going to be dropped 3 days later on August 9th, 1945, on Nagasaki. And that is Fat Man, a plutonium bomb. And what you have then is, the way to remember this is real pretty simple. Most people know the word Hiroshima. They remember it kind of. But basically, the bomb used on Hiroshima was Little Boy. The bomb used on Nagasaki was Fat Man. Here's the thing. You can never be a fat man unless you were once a little boy. So little boys come first. Fat mans come later. And the actual date on this thing is going to, again, be August 6th and August 9th. The month of August is the 8th. It's like the eternal thing, the infinity thing. And then 69 is going to be the yin-yang. And that will be the end of the war. Ironically, just to give you a setup for the next thing, Franklin Delano Roosevelt will die before those decisions to be made were, and Harry Truman will make some different decisions. We'll talk about that in a little while. But at the Yalta Conference, the topic of French colonies in places like Indochina, as Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. What should we do with French colonies since France surrendered after like 12 seconds of fighting in World War II? Actually, it was more than that, but 14, 15 seconds. And Stalin and Franklin Delano Roosevelt say, well, they shouldn't get the colonies back. Franklin Delano Roosevelt will die, and we will give those colonies back to Charles de Gaulle of France once he demands it. And that will be the beginning of the Vietnam War, all the way back in 1945. We'll talk about that one later, but I'm pretty sure it's not going to be part of the test. The test will only go up to 1945, and that's where we are. All right, guys. Biggest, baddest war. Good luck on the test.